Good morning, everyone. So we are Group 5. We are discussing and reporting the lesson 4.5, the fortuitous event. What is fortuitous event? A fortuitous event is any event which cannot be foreseen or which do foreseen is inevitable. Stated otherwise, it is an event which is either impossible to foreseen or impossible to avoid. Ito yung hindi natin ine-expect na mangyari at imposibleng maiwasan natin na mangyari. For example, typhoon o bagyo. Ito yung nangyayari na hindi natin ine-expect na darating na hindi natin nakikita at maiwasan. Because it's impossible to foresee and to avoid it. Tsaka na lang natin malalaman na may bagyo ng dahil sa teknolohiya. Another example is may i-organize akong beach wedding. Bukas, everything are prepared and done. But kinabukasan, while the wedding ongoing, biglang umulan ng malakas na hindi namin ina-expect because you cannot foreseen and avoid. Ito yung ibig sabihin ng fortuitous event. Another definition of fortuitous event, the essence of a fortuitous event consists of being happening independent of the will of the debtor or obligor, and which happening make the normal fulfillment the obligation impossible. We all know that debtor or obligor are responsible to doing or not to doing their duty. But ang naka-state dito is fulfillment of obligation impossible, which mean the debtor are not fulfilling their obligation at doon na pumapasok sa liable for damages or liable for fortuitous event. Fortuitous event distinguished from the force majeure, which mean unforeseeable or unforeseen circumstances that prevent someone from fulfilling a contract. There are two related to the concept, which is an act of man and act of God. An act of man, is strictly speaking, fortuitous event is an event independent of the will of obligor but not of the other human wills. Act of man is described act to perform by an individual of sounds and mind. For example, the stated of act of man example is war, fire, robbery, murder that can act of man but not human will. Ito yung pwedeng gawin ng ibang tao sa atin na hindi nating gustong mangyari sa ating sarili at sa ibang tao. Another example of act of man is airplane crashing due the engine tempering or faulty maintenance because hindi nila dinoble check first bago magpalipad ng eroplano. This is the act of man that cause injury, death, damages na not human wills. Next is act of God. They refer to what is called major or those events which are totally independent will of every human being. Example, earthquake, flood, rain, lightning, volcanic eruptions, and etc. Ito yung mga impossible to foresee and impossible to avoid na pwedeng mangyari anytime. For example, you will selling a house to your friend. The contract is after 6 months will reward the house. But unfortunately, adahaan nga napakpakadaan nga sa kuna. Just like typhoon or earthquake. Kit balay kit totally damages. But because of an fortuitous event, you're not liable for damages if not applicable to genetic thing, but unfortunately it's applicable for a specific thing, which means specific thing is already segregated from class. You are agreed to deliver that thing, and the genetic thing, it is not segregated from class, mean you will still replace it like a money because a genetic thing never perish.
There are two kinds of fortuitous events. Number one is ordinary fortuitous events. those events which are common and which the contracting parties could reasonably foresee, which are events that normally happen and inevitable, like for example, rain, flooding during a typhoon. Number 2 is the extraordinary fortuitous events, which are uncommon and which the contracting parties could not have reasonably foreseen, which cannot be foreseen and don't usually happen, like for example, war, fire, and earthquake.
Requisites of a fortuitous event. Number 1, the cause of rage is independent of the debtor's will. Being independent is to prove that can survive on their own without the help of others. Number 2, the event is unforeseeable or unavoidable. Unforeseeable or unavoidable, something unexpected has happened that prevents an event or situation. Just like COVID-19 pandemic, we are not expected to happen. Number 3, the event is such as to render it impossible for the debtor to fulfill his obligation in a normal manner. Impossible performance of the obligation must be general. It must be impossible for anyone to perform the act in the existing circumstances. Impossible, something that's impossible can be done. Number 4, the debtor did not take part in causing the injury to the creditor. Did not take part if there was fault on the part of anyone. Of them all shall be responsible to the creditor.
General rule, no one liable for fortuitous event. Dili kay nang sa kitaan nga liable kanya na fortuitous the general rule, which means is kung makikita tayong mangyayari kanya ni creditor ken debtor. There are 3 exceptions to general rule. First is the law or stipulation expressly to declare. 2 is when the nature of the obligation requires the assumption of risk. Number 3, obligation is other than an obligation to give a specific thing. Number 4, debtor is already in delay.
Another example is Soledad bound herself to give Martin a specific heavy-duty stand-up mixer on November 29, 2021. While on her way to deliver the mixer, she was robbed by a group of armed men. There was nothing she could do. So, pag may fortuitous event po, maaaring ma-extinguish ang obligation ni obligor or debtor, but may exemptions din na kahit nangyari yung fortuitous event, meron pa din na fault si obligor or debtor, and the exemptions considered are the following. Number 1, law or stipulation expressly so declare. In other words, the parties have agreed that even if there is losses due to fortuitous event, the obligation will subsist or the obligation will continue. Why? Because you are free to stipulate whatever terms in the contract as long as it is not against the law, morals, customs, public order, or public policy. A possessor in bad faith shall be liable for deterioration or loss in every case, even if caused by a fortuitous event. So if there is a bad faith, even if there is a loss due to fortuitous event, the obliger is still liable for damages. The bailey in commodatum is liable for the loss of the thing even if it should be through a fortuitous event, for certain instances. The officious manager in negotiorum gestio shall be liable for any fortuitous event in certain instances. Kahit may fortuitous event, kung may kontrata or usapan or agreement, both party agreed that kahit may fortuitous event, liable ka pa din at dapat clearly and expressly stated and provided yung liability in case of fortuitous event. Number 2, when the nature of obligation requires the assumption of risk. The risk is the essential in an obligation. So kahit may fortuitous event, they would perform the obligation dahil ito yung nature of obligation. It is very essence of it. Example, insurance sa sunog, namatay. The nature of obligation of insurance requires the assumption of risk.
Number 3. Obligation is other than an obligation to give a specific thing. Example, obligation to give a generic thing. So, if ever nawala man yung isang bagay na yun, supposedly i-deliver or supposedly magbabayad ka ng pera. So, money is considered a generic thing. So, pag nagbabayad ka ng pera tapos sabihin na lang natin na nanakaw yung perang yon, hindi ma-extinguish ang obligation mo dahil ang pera ay isang generic thing. So, yun ang mangyayari doon. Pwede mo namang pambayad ang ibang pera, pero kapag specific thing kasi hindi ka pwedeng mag-deliver ng other thing kasi yung specific thing na yun ang napag-usapan yun na kailangan i-deliver or obliged na i-deliver si debtor. Number 4. Obligation is already in delay. Another example of this is Glyza promised to give his dog named Princess to Jessa to be delivered on August 26, 2021. Suppose Glyza did not deliver the dog on August 26 when Jessa demanded it. In this case, Glyza incurs delay. So, si Glyza in delay na siya officially. So, when Glyza decides to deliver the dog on August 26, but before he reached Jessa's house, the dog was struck by a lightning and immediately killed it on the spot. Although, yung naging reason for lost the dog is fortuitous event, hindi na po mag-a-apply yung general rule natin, which is no one shall be liable for fortuitous event, which effectively distinguishes supposedly distinguish or one's obligation, pero in this case, hindi po ma-distinguish ang kanyang obligation. Bakit? Because she already incurred delay.